Alright everyone, I am back today with a review of the next installment in Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot series, which is 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, also released in the US as the Patriotic Murders, and again as An Overdose of Death. In my opinion, the title Murder at the Dentist would have worked just as fine, because that's what this novel is about, at least for a while. And I just loved this premise and setup. Once you think you've seen it all, like Agatha Christie could be running out of exotic locales abroad in which to have people mysteriously murdered right under Hercule Poirot's vacationing nose, she turns the tables and has someone murdered in the most mundane of places, the dentist's office. Not only that, but it quickly becomes clear that an ordinary dentist's office, with people being called into and out of the doctor's room, and with a few side or office rooms and a waiting area, but a mostly closed-off environment, is an environment that actually allows for some interesting possibilities for covering up a murder, but maybe even more so, some important restrictions for us as investigators when thinking about what can't have happened. I'll stop right here and mention that the first half of this review is going to be totally spoiler-free, and then I'll get into the spoilery section for those of you who have already read the book, or who just don't care, but I'll warn you when we get to that point. This novel was often entertaining, but not one of the better Poirot novels I've read by any means. Now why is that, since I was just raving about how cool of a premise A Murder at the Dentist's Office is? Well, the problem is that despite a promising start, before long our investigation soon veers off into territory far afield of the crime scene, chasing down missing suspects all around town in what can only be characterized as more of a spy mystery style novel than the whodunits I've really come to love from Agatha Christie's Poirot series. If you enjoyed Christie's earlier novel The Big Four, which involves some kind of ring of international criminals and a feeling of super high stakes, you might enjoy this one. Unfortunately, I have to say that I couldn't even finish The Big Four on my first attempt a few years ago, although I wasn't in the best mood at the time, so I'm going to someday give it another fair shot. As we start delving into the motives and backstories of the suspects, though, it becomes less awesome than your typical Poirot mystery. It's suggested to us towards the start that the murdered dentist was likely not the intended target of this hit. Others suggest that the likely target was actually the fairly politically conservative banker Alistair Blunt, a man who some of his left-wing opponents, including one who was at the dentist's office that day, would like to see out of the way, perhaps by any means necessary. This theory seems to be bolstered by the successive death of another character and then an additional one who goes missing. Except for one problem, which is that if Blunt was really the intended target, how did his would-be killers manage to bungle things up so badly? And this, as I saw it when I was about a quarter or a third of the way into the book, is kind of the crux of this novel. Still avoiding going into any spoilers here, there are these seemingly super important political motivations for the crime, even if we as readers haven't quite added things up yet by the middle of the novel. At the same time, we can't rule out the possibility that this was just an ordinary crime that coincidentally happened on the day Alistair Blunt was in the office, can we? Which means you basically have to follow two threads at once. One being this almost larger-than-life story in which everyone who was at the dentist's office this afternoon is part of some vast conspiracy on one side or the other, and on the other hand, the more mundane version in which maybe someone had an ordinary motive, like blackmail or something like that, or wanting to run off with someone's wife, or get their money, or just get revenge on someone, or whatever. The interesting aspect about this, though, is that neither explanation really seems to fit the scale of the crime. The political espionage explanations just seem too grandiose, while the more mundane explanations seem, well, too minor, given that before long several people have either died or disappeared. The political aspect of this book was not so interesting to me, and I personally didn't find it was very well done, because it wasn't quite enough on the side to really work as just sort of a type of commentary, as it is in other books like Appointment with Death, when one of the characters happens to be a member of parliament. In that book, the character Lady Westholme provides a little bit of political commentary from Christie, sometimes a little bit of satire, but there this commentary isn't really necessary to understanding the plot. Here, though, understanding who the characters are and what they represent, such as the fascist thug or the radical leftists, becomes quite important in understanding their potential motives. This all just took me out of the story because to me it wasn't intricate or interesting enough for me to really understand the political nuances, which I think would have been pretty hard to do without a more in-depth knowledge of the exact historical situation in the early years of World War II when this book was set. It does at least make sense to me, though, given the book's writing and publication in the early years of World War II, that Christie, like undoubtedly many other writers, felt moved to try something different and to frame her latest novel within the all-consuming war situation that she found herself living in. I'll at least give her credit for trying something new here, instead of just sticking entirely to the tried-and-true formula, but I still didn't like the result. For a differing and more positive opinion on this aspect of the book, though, and for a better and still spoiler-free explanation of the historical context of the political tensions described in this book, I'd recommend the review from Mara at bookslikewhoa, which is an excellent review and which I'll link below. And what's with the title? 1-2 Buckle My Shoe is an obvious reference to the old nursery rhyme, reminiscent of the 10 Little Soldiers rhyme she used in And Then There Were None. Unfortunately, while it worked in that novel, here it's just pure gimmick, and I'm afraid I can't even give Christie any credit for her attempt. Basically, she's trying to retell this nursery rhyme as a mystery novel, and she sort of weaves in different lines of it throughout the book, and, well, it just really doesn't work, which might be what you'd expect from a rhyme with such miscellaneous lines as 9, 10, a big fat hen. But don't worry, I'm not spoiling the ending for you here, because the version of the poem that's used in the book actually goes up to 20, so we're only halfway to the ending when Poirot casually compares a random character or suspect or whatever you want to call her to a big fat hen. So to sum all of that up, if you do read this novel, try to enjoy it more for the thrill of the chase and not for the promise of solving the mystery yourself. It's weird to say that for an Agatha Christie novel, but I really mean it here. Now I'm going to get into the spoilery section, so grab your books and run now if you haven't finished this book and if you plan to read it. So as I mentioned, there's a possibility that there's this grand web of political espionage going on and explaining everything that's happening here. I suspected and hoped that this was probably not the case because it didn't seem very plausible, and Agatha Christie seems to go for solutions that, even if a bit out there, are actually plausible. I mean, she's not writing James Bond novels or anything like that. So I suspected that this whole political espionage plot was totally a ruse, but never could totally dismiss it either. Because, well, you never know if she decided to make this novel the spiritual successor to the Big Four or something. Unfortunately, it was this very fact that made the mystery investigation deeply unsatisfying for me. I felt like I constantly had to dignify this silly political plot that I didn't find very interesting, believable, or easy to follow, even though I was pretty sure that it was not relevant except to the extent that whoever was pushing the political narrative was probably someone to keep a very close eye on. Even setting all this political narrative aside, there remained another problem. For any more ordinary theories I had, there also would then be a lot of other people who were lying in a way that didn't make much sense. Thus, as often is the case even in the better Poirot novels, it seemed very difficult to come up with an ordinary explanation that didn't involve this whole espionage thread, because quite a few different characters seemed to be buying into this whole espionage theory. And in the end, Poirot reveals that this level of complication is somewhat important, actually. The fact that there were 3 victims and that a lot of wild things are going on is either evidence of a vast conspiracy with grand import, like everyone's suggesting throughout the book, or it's evidence of a murderer with ample means to pull off something complicated and a blatant disregard for innocent human casualties, since at least some of these victims must not be linked to the actual situation. And the reality is this latter explanation, and the murderer is none other than the would-be victim Alistair Blunt himself. But his specific motive, which is one that involves covering up evidence of a double marriage, doesn't really feel like something I ever would have or could have worked out. So indeed, the lack of clear motives for any of the characters, aside from the political ones, made me feel kind of lukewarm about the mystery investigation because I assumed there was some kind of explanation here that was too complicated for me to figure out, quite possibly involving the backstories of the characters abroad. However, one redeeming quality of the story is that although I'd be amazed if someone worked out the full details of this almost fantastical mystery plot, there are a lot of things that readers will be able to figure out, much of them thanks to some of Christie's stronger moments. For example, I think many readers will correctly deduce that at least something with Mabel Sainsbury Seal is absolutely not what it seems to be. I myself suspected her for a while, pretty much right after she disappeared, and especially so after the shenanigans where she shows up supposedly dead in Mrs. Chapman's residence. Of course, like many others probably were, I was fooled by the seeming obviousness of the defaced body into thinking it wasn't Sainsbury Seal discovered at the flat. It was only towards the final couple hours of the book when Poirot remarks that he knows where she is, but he doesn't know if she's dead or alive, that I pieced it together that the Sainsbury Seal who we saw in the dentist's office is probably not the real one, and that she probably was playing some kind of a part. In hindsight, this was hinted from the very first time we saw her. When exiting a cab heading into the dentist's office, she appeared prim and proper, but the driver then made such a fuss about how she'd left hardly any tip, which seems totally out of character for a higher class woman. So by the middle of the book, my theory is something like this. Someone goes to their appointment, I was going to say it's Sainsbury Seal because she had the appointment prior to Amberiotis. She kills the dentist and poses as the dentist since, as we learned, the next patient, Amberiotis, was a new patient, so he wouldn't have recognized if the dentist he was seeing wasn't really the real dentist. If you're a little more astute than me, you may have found it unbelievable that Sainsbury Seal could have easily impersonated a man herself, which might have led you to think that someone else was implicated. I didn't really make it this far, though. She then, in my theory, poisons the patient, goes to 1 or 2 interviews, and kills this woman, Mrs. Chapman, who looks very much like her because she wants to fake her own death, and then runs off to escape justice forever. Of course, as for the motive, I had no idea. Maybe it was a romance with like this Secret Service agent or something like that. But in itself, this chain of events seemed plausible, and indeed it involved some morsels of truth, even if I had the identities wrong. It also seemed possible that if Sainsbury Seal was directly involved with the murder, when she encountered Blunt randomly in the street in a time that was before the start of the novel, but we learn about only later, that she had somehow influenced him to attend this particular dentist because it would work in concocting sort of a fanciful cover story to why she conducted this murder plan. Like maybe she dropped a newspaper clipping with an advertisement or something that tipped him in that this was a good dentist to go to. A little bit of a stretch, and it turned out to be all wrong, as it was the real Sainsbury Seal who Blunt encountered in the street, and it wasn't a lie at all that she knew him previously, which was for Blunt the whole problem that made him feel the need to murder her in the first place. Another point that many readers will be onto, even if we don't interpret it quite correctly, is the assassination attempts on Mr. Blunt. They were, as I pretty much guessed, staged, although I never really pieced it together that Mr. Blunt himself was in on them. All this is to say that the mystery plot has some good, sound, and solvable elements, but unfortunately I just found that Christie takes it a few steps too far by the end in this one. And part of that is also because for me, the dentist's office setting remained above and beyond the best aspect of the mystery. It was here that I was able to figure out that it must not have actually been the real dentist who had operated on Amberiotis, even though I hadn't realized it was Mr. Blunt himself who did the murder. This is another example of this interesting device that Christie has used before, where we're not sure when a murder took place, and because there are successive testimonies, we know that if one character is lying about something big, we know that successive characters who were in the dentist's office should either fail to confirm that lie or they are lying themselves. This happened as well in the novel Appointment with Death, too, which was the first Poirot novel I reviewed on this channel, and I found it one of the best aspects of the mystery in that story. Here, though, it's mostly left as an exercise to the reader to piece all that together, and not much attention is paid to it. This feels like a bit of a slight, since it's clearly a crucial part, and perhaps the most crucial part of the mystery. Instead, the narrative just spends too much time wandering off into the investigation of side incidents and this search for a motive that in the end turns out to be not the most interesting aspect. And that's where, for me, it fails. The exploration of the dentist's office environment as a crime scene was sufficient in some sense, but not completely thorough. On one hand, this is okay because it gave me plenty of room to think it out myself, but you see, at the beginning of the book, I immediately started forming ideas about how maybe someone was hiding in the dentist's office after their appointment, and stuff like that. And the detectives opened up that possibility, but then seemed to get caught up in this whole international conspiracy in a way that kind of drew the interest away from the central question of how the murder itself was actually performed. And as I've mentioned before in my other Poirot reviews, I usually don't really like it when the core of the solution is right there in front of you at the start, and then you spend the middle half of the book just trying to pretend you're not listening so that you don't get led off the scent. That's not quite what happened here, and yet a lot of the stuff in the middle of the book is more for thrills than for any true investigation. So, an interesting book? Yeah, I'll give it that. Just not one of the better Poirot mysteries. What did you think, though? Am I totally off base? Leave me a comment letting me know where you thought this one ranked among the Poirot series, and like or subscribe if you're interested in more weekly reviews, including an upcoming review of the next Poirot installment, Evil Under the Sun. And until next time, bye, and happy reading.